I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
We're going to have different notions of good. We really are. But those need to be really robustly represented.
That's Tish Warren, Anglican priest and opinion writer for the New York Times. Our conversation today examines the complexity of articulating one's convictions in a pluralistic world against the prevailing tendency to reduce people and issues to polarized binary categories. Tish, who does theology in public, has found that the work requires a serious commitment to nuance and understanding.
If we are able to kind of talk about things, if we're able to hash things out, more good will come from that, like more flourishing in our communities.
This, plus Tish on her book, The Liturgy of the Ordinary, all coming right up.
I'm David Remnick, and each week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, my colleagues and I unpack what's happening in a very complicated world. You'll hear from the New Yorker's award-winning reporters and thinkers, Jelani Cobb on race and justice, Jill Lepore on American history, Vincent Cunningham and Gia Tolentino on culture, Bill McKibben on climate change, and many more. To get the context behind events in the news, listen to the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. If you are new to No Small Endeavor, you may not know that our history as an organization precedes our podcast and public radio show. We began as a live variety show here in Nashville, a mashup of outstanding musicians, world-class vocalists, best-selling authors, and top-of-their-game intellectuals. Few comedy sketches thrown in here and there, bringing together folks from all walks of life and all manner of convictions to explore some question or topic that was of mutual interest. It's super fun, and by the way, we still have our shows, and we'd be delighted if you would come join. But one of the taglines we often used with regard to our live shows was breaking down false dichotomies. That is, we made it plain that conventional wisdom often gives us either-or choices, binary choices. It's either this or that, but not both. But many of these either-or dichotomies are false. That is, many times it really can be both and rather than either-or. Our seeking to break down false dichotomies is a way we seek to challenge the too easy dismissal of the convictions, insights, or consideration of others by simply cataloging them as representatives of the unacceptable pole of the dichotomy. Our guest today, Tish Warren, is an example of someone who pushes against that way of seeing the world, and she herself does not quite fit into the prevailing polarized binary categories of left or right, liberal or traditional. Tish is a Christian doing public theology, an Anglican priest, and an opinion writer for the New York Times. Here's our conversation. Tish Warren is a priest in the Anglican Church in North America. She's the author of the award-winning book Liturgy of the Ordinary, as well as Prayer in the Night. Currently, Tish writes a weekly newsletter for the New York Times and is also a columnist for Christianity Today. She's a founding member of the Pelican Project and a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum. She lives with her husband and 3 children in the Austin, Texas area. Welcome, Tish Warren.
Thanks.
It's good to have you with us.
I'm glad to be here.
And spent several years in Nashville a number of years ago, right?
Yes, I did. I love Nashville still.
Yeah.
2 of my 3 kids were born there. So
yeah,
special place.
It is a
Vanderbilt
special
Hospital.
place. Yes. So I actually would like to begin with a story about your time in Nashville as a way to ask to what degree the things that surfaced in that encounter do or do not kind of give us a sense of the kind of theology in public that you have continued to do in your work to this day. Yeah.
Okay.
So this controversy that happened at Vanderbilt when you were here in Nashville, would you just kind of share with folks kind of some of the main features of that controversy?
Yeah. So I was a campus minister at Vanderbilt. I worked with InterVarsity graduate and faculty ministries. And so you have to turn in a constitution for your organization to get on-campus status there, and we'd used the same one forever, and it had been approved. And then suddenly it was disapproved. And the change was that they instituted a policy called an all-comers policy, which meant that every student had to be able to be in membership or leadership of any organization on campus, which meant you couldn't put any kind of prohibitions on who could lead your group. So our group, like many other groups on campus, everyone was welcome, super open door, anyone could come. But to be on our core leadership team, which is about 5 students, you had to sign InterVarsity Statement of Belief, which is a pretty broad statement of evangelical faith. And you had to continue to subscribe to that throughout your tenure. So the idea was that if you were leading a Bible study or you were like the president of our group, we would want you to be a Christian. Say someone like a Unitarian doesn't believe in the Trinity, or even someone who might have a different, maybe like a Jehovah's Witness or Mormon, who has like a different understanding of that, would be welcome to come in our group, as would an atheist, as would anyone. But to lead, to be one of the core people leading Bible studies or the whole organization, we asked people to believe certain things. And this wasn't uncommon. The Catholic group wanted their leaders to be Catholic. I should back up and say, to outsiders, this sounds like, okay, this is crazy. Like, why would someone who's not Catholic even try to lead a Bible study in the Catholic group, right? But it happens. First of all, it does. But also what you see a lot is students deconverting, like we appoint them a Bible study leader, or whatever. They go study abroad or they go whatever. And then they come back and they sort of change belief or change their faith. It happens all the time in college, happens all the time in grad school. This is very common. And it's fine. It's fine to explore that. But then if you have radically different belief than an organization, the only way to have a theological coherence of an organization is for you to step out of that position, and you could start your own group or join another group or whatever you want to do. So this could work out lots and lots of different ways. If it was an anti-war group, someone couldn't, suddenly take up an interest in assault weapons and still remain on their leadership team. A recycling group wouldn't have to let a climate change denier to be the, front man of their group. And it goes on and on. Well, they did this because they opposed discrimination, quote unquote discrimination. And they felt like any discrimination whatsoever was akin to what's called invidious, hateful discrimination, right? And so we protested this in all kinds of ways. We had lots of talks with administrators. There were actual student protests about it. There was a big conversation about it on campus because my group and 4 other groups were put on probation, that we had to essentially drop any requirements for leaders whatsoever, any religious requirements or belief of doctrine whatsoever, or lose our on-campus status. So it was a huge controversy. It became national news. Fox News came down, MSNBC came down. It became like a culture war kind of issue. We were in the middle of it. My husband was a grad student at the time. Like he was getting his PhD at Vanderbilt. And so I was a campus minister working with students who loved the university, who had given years and years of the life of the university. Most of them hoped to be professors. And it was formative for us, for sure. And I still think it's just the absolute breakdown of pluralism. It's the absolute breakdown of being able to have many, many different ideas around the table. I think they would say, no, the all-comers policy is to get lots of ideas around the table. But the notion there is that every individual can have their individual ideas. There can't be assembly or groups or communities that have a shared ethos on campus represented. And one of the notions of freedom of speech is that it's not just giving individuals free speech, it's giving groups free speech, so that a church together, for instance, could believe something, or like an environmental group together actually has far more influence than just lots of individual environmentalists, right? And so we had a big ol' conversation around that on campus in all kinds of ways. That's when I started kind of writing, was partly that, but also things like we had town hall meetings, loads and loads. I just had endless meetings with administration folks from Vanderbilt and with my students. And at the end of that year, it was something around 1,000 to 1,500 students lost their on-campus status. So we were thrown off campus, and that's how it's continued till today. Now, the university continues in different ways. They've found workarounds for that, where they're meeting off campus and that sort of thing. But some really basic things, like one of the ways that we would meet students every year is at this, organization fair where all different organizations on campus would be. We couldn't do that anymore. We couldn't reserve rooms on campus at the time anymore. We couldn't use Vanderbilt's name in any way. So it did have like an actual deleterious effect on the group. And I think it was a loss for religious liberty, for freedom of assembly on campus. I don't, to be clear, when I say freedom of assembly, like there's no constitutional violation here. Vanderbilt is a private school. It can do whatever it wants, but it's not a good way to do pluralism. It was essentially saying religious groups are welcome on campus as long as they're fine with people not really believing what they say.
Yeah.
But if you're the type of religious group that actually has, requires certain dogmas or doctrines, then you're not welcome at Vanderbilt.
Yeah. You said at one point that that couching the discussion as the university versus Christian students was unhelpful, and instead you wanted to emphasize that it was much more, from your perspective, a matter of whether or not we were going to take pluralism seriously as a practice. And you alluded to that a moment ago, but unpack that just a little bit more. How do you see, from someone who is taking a perspective of a commitment to Christian orthodoxy, how do you see a commitment to pluralism going hand in hand with that?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that the part of the reason I said that is because the narrative is too easy because of the culture wars. It's too simple to say, like, either on the right, the evil secular university and the, martyr Christian students, or the left would be like the, university standing against discrimination and the evil fundamentalist Christians. Those are the easy things to talk about on social media. That's the easy tropes. But the reality was different. I mean, especially when you took the group of these 10 groups that were getting kicked off campus, it was some of the most racially diverse groups on campus. The students that I worked with were all literally like the best scholars in the world. I mean, these are people getting PhDs in things like biophysics at Vanderbilt. Like, they're leading their fields. These are not folks that are like deeply, fundamentalist, hate the secular university. So what I saw more is that the university had a very particular understanding of what inclusion was. And that was, I think, sort of unthinking embrace of the notion of just all discrimination is bad. And everyone has to be accepted everywhere. No one's feelings are hurt anywhere. But what they were wanting was sort of a mushy middle, I would say a relativism. The creed at Vanderbilt that you were required to sign to be on campus, whether they said it or not, it was unstated, was that it doesn't really matter what you believe. We can all sort of be equal in our beliefs or whatever. But nobody actually lived that way. What I mean is that the environmentalist group would not be okay with a climate change denier coming. They just kind of bet that wasn't going to happen. So we felt like we can't sign this form, you're making a sign that says we will have no belief requirements for our leaders without lying. But we felt like we can't teach our students just sign a form isn't true to get by. I mean, I feel like if we care about their discipleship, we're like setting them up for future tax fraud if we say just sign any form that makes your life better. I've worked quite a bit in the last year with Interfaith Alliance, Ibu Patel, who's a Muslim.
Sure.
And we talk about this. The difference between relativism says, all of our religions are basically the same. I'm not trying to convert you. You're not trying to convert me. We all just sort of think this is all the same. Versus true pluralism that says, no, we have deep differences. We have deep distinctions. Let's be honest about that. Let's be truthful about that. And let on a campus or a nation or a city, let that be robustly represented. And you come to me with who you really are and what you really think, and I'll come to you with who I really am and what I really think. But we can do that with friendship. We can do that respectfully. We can do that without shouting each other down. And we can do that in a way that allows each other to, as the cliche says, to coexist and to flourish even. And so I'm a deep, deep believer in pluralism. I'll say as a side note, the same year, just down the road, hour away or so, I don't know, it was Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the city disallowed a mosque from being built. Right. I don't know if you remember this controversy. And I think it went to a higher court. I don't know how far up it went, but they wouldn't allow a mosque to be built. Essentially, it was just anti-Muslim discrimination. It was just that for whatever reason, the city felt this mosque was not good for their city.
Here, Tish is referring to an episode in which the Rutherford County Regional Planning Committee approved plans for a new Islamic center's construction there in Murfreesboro. But following that approval, there were acts of vandalism, lawsuits, bullying, and even arson from those who protested against the construction of the new center. One group of residents took up the legal cause against the Islamic Center. Finally, after some years of the case traveling through the courts, it was finally appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which denied to hear the case, thus effectively allowing the center to open.
Well, so that is discrimination from the right? There was anti-Muslim sentiment, which we still see. And then you had the secular university, kicking these Christian students out. I see that disease as the exact same. It was manifested in two different ways, one on the right and one on the left, but it was the same impulse, which is we decide which groups get to be represented in this community and which groups don't get to be represented in this community. Yeah. And I was as opposed to that as I was to what was happening in our midst. And I think it's the same thing. I think it's exactly the same thing, really, or very near the same. And I think there's a lot of folks on the left that would say, no, it's different. As I just watched Annie Hall this week, actually, and Woody Allen says famously, I'm a bigot, but for the left, right? And so he's saying it's okay if it's for the left, or vice versa, like people on the right in this standing against this mosque, we're just standing for whatever,
right.
Christian truth, the American way. But both groups are basically just committed to only having their pre-approved creed sit at the table as a collective group.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Tish Warren, New York Times opinion columnist. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes, as well as a transcript. Coming up, Tish and I discuss the psychological pull of thinking that in order to live a good life, you need to go somewhere else and do something extraordinary, but that the path to a good life might lie in the ordinariness of right where you are.
I'm David Remnick, and each week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, my colleagues and I unpack what's happening in a very complicated world. You'll hear from the New Yorker's award-winning reporters and thinkers, Jelani Cobb on race and justice, Jill Lepore on American history, Vincent Cunningham and Gia Tolentino on culture, Bill McKibben on climate change, and many more. To get the context behind events in the news, listen to the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you get your podcasts.
You, at some point, discuss, or someone writing about you talks about how you had done work in intentional Christian communities, been attracted to new monasticism, Dorothy Day, worked with impoverished populations in the U.S. and abroad, and said, quote, you found yourself a 30-something with 2 kids living a more or less ordinary life. And what I'm slowly realizing is that, for me, being in the house all day with a baby and a 2-year-old is a lot more scary and a lot harder than being in a war-torn African village.
Right.
What I need courage for is the ordinary, the daily, everydayness of life. That's a compelling line. But before you talk about the punchline there, give us just a little glimpse of what some of your engagement with new monasticism, Dorothy Day, and the like looked like and entailed.
Yeah, so just in my 20s, especially, a lot of my work was with various economically disadvantaged groups. And so my first job out of college was leading this local ministry with these apartments with mostly, it was cheap apartments with almost entirely undocumented immigrants. And so I saw how folks were being really exploited in the sense that they were coming over here, they didn't have documentation, so they had to take basically any job they could. So they weren't getting overtime, they weren't getting workers' comp, but they were working really, really hard, usually at factories, farms, processing plants, like chicken processing plants. And so we worked with their kids a lot, mostly teaching English, and then worked pretty briefly with a group that worked with homeless teenagers and lived in community with folks there and was always sort of around. This was the whole new monasticism thing. Shane Claiborne, when I started all this, he had not come out with his first book yet, as far as I know. And I think he had not been yet featured on Christianity Today. So this was kind of a new movement. Yeah. And so I had lived in community twice, and then, it never became a big thing, like became a community house or whatever. But they would have these gatherings called Papa Fest that I went to a couple of times, and then ended up part of this little group in Austin that our friend Steven, who did urban farming with the homeless, and he was super involved in a lot of those conversations. And so kind of through him would end up going to these events. And then I went to Africa for a while and taught English over there. So if it sounds to you like, wow, she just bounced around and lived a bunch of places and did a lot of things, that would be accurate. I worked at 2 different churches right after college and then in seminary, and both of those jobs, they were kind of resourced churches, like middle-class churches. And I was connecting them to ministry to folks around us who were homeless, who had mental illness, who almost always had poverty issues, addiction issues. So a lot of what I did in that season was take sort of middle-class folks and the needs of community and try to convince these middle-class folks to respond to the needs of their community.
So then going back to that quote I read a moment ago, how would you narrate then this kind of shift from that sort of very engaged, even if you are bouncing around, you're the consistent note of engaging with those on the margins, those dealing with economic deprivation, those dealing with various forms of systemic marginalization, to a life as a mom with 2 young kids. And I wrote in my notes, I wonder how many of us read Tolstoy, Dorothy Day, and the like, and then find ourselves with families and a mortgage, and then trying to narrate how we make sense of that sort of transition in our lives. So what did that look like for you? And then, of course, that led to, I guess, your first book in certain ways.
Yeah. Yes. It's the crisis of my life in many, many ways.
Yeah.
I still love Dorothy Day. I mean, I still find those people heroic. I love Dorothy Day. It's interesting because Dorothy Day was a mom. But when you read about it, you're like, first of all, she was a mother of one. That is different. But also you go, man, this was a pretty unstable situation for her daughter to grow up in, which I think her daughter would admit to. There's probably real beauty.
I think her daughter
that.
Has said that publicly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. At the time, I think I would have been like, well, I sold out. I hope that wasn't it. I ended up marrying my husband, who did not want to go overseas, was getting a PhD at Vanderbilt. And we had children. And it's a little tongue-in-cheek when I say, it's clear there was not more danger in my life than when I was in Africa. But there is something true about that. Where I was in Africa was actually a little dangerous. I was 9 miles from Congo, and we would see sort of low-range bombs exploding. And at times, the conflicts there, which were kind of guerrilla warfare, would spill over. So there was some level of threat, and there would be times where our team leadership would say, like, you can't leave at night. You have to stay where you are. But I had less anxiety. It was more fearful, but there was like less anxiety than having these two little kids. Granted, I understand, it was much safer. I was much more privileged. And that's what was intriguing to me about it. Is like, why is it easier for me to trust God, to have less anxiety in these situations that clearly, objectively are more terrifying or more dangerous than in just like the warp and woof of regular life with these kids in East Nashville. And it was because, to some extent, like, I just had no vision of what it meant to be sort of an ordinary American following Jesus. I just had no concept of what that could look like, and no concept of how God might actually meet me in that. And so I always sort of fantasized about these situations, other situations I could be in where God would really meet me, but never in my actual life. I wasn't sure how to encounter God in the life that I was actually living, the life that was before me. And so I wrote that piece, Courage in the Ordinary, long time ago. This is one of the very first pieces I ever wrote as a writer. So it's a billion years ago that it came out now. It was over 10 that I wrote it, for sure. But I think I was just really intrigued of like, why do I have more anxiety in my daily life in ordinary America, which is really wrapped around with privilege, than I have had in these kind of riskier situations before. So then for those who are unfamiliar with what it might mean to have a liturgy of the ordinary, can you make kind of a brief case for that and what that has meant for you? Well, I would say you should read the book, first of all. It's my briefest case, is read this book. So the book I wrote several years after the article that you just quoted, but it deals with a lot of the same ideas. And that's because I was deeply, deeply wrestling with these questions. What's it mean to meet God in the actual life I have, not the life I think I should have, or the life I dream of having, but the actual life I'm living? What does it mean to encounter God in ordinary times where I am not on the battlefield. I'm not in a war-torn place. I'm not in ecstasy. Things aren't amazing. Things also, though, I'm not in deep suffering. I'm not dying of cancer. It's just sort of like life. And what does it mean to know God in the midst of lifey life, And so I was wrestling with these ideas a lot. And there was a spate of books that came out in the late aughts, there was a movement in especially evangelical circles where everything was sort of like radical and on fire. And there were books called like Radical, and this looked different ways. It would go, go be among the poorest of the poor. There was a movement for that. There was like the Wild at Heart kind of books, which are not go live among the poorest of the poor, but they're also like don't live an ordinary life. That's like elk hunting and I don't know, whatever, like canoeing alone through the mountains, or
at least push yourself out of your so-called comfort zone, I guess.
Yeah. So there were all those books, and then there was a bit of a counter trend after that, where I believe it's Michael Horton came out with a book called Ordinary. There was another book that came out around the same time called Boring. There was this like group of books that were all sort of like how to meet God in the mundane. And they were all very helpful books. I quote some of them even in my book. But it felt incomplete to me because it still felt like mostly information, basically telling me, explaining to me that my ordinary life mattered to God. But I was like, okay, so how's that help me? In the sense of, am I supposed to be like folding laundry and changing my baby's diaper and saying like a mantra, like this matters to Jesus, And so for me, it was like, how does it matter? Why does it matter? What difference is this making? So the notion of small things, small notions, the way that actual repair of the world is very small and very molecular for everyone. I mean, for Mother Teresa, like the actual way her day looked was very small acts of love. I mean, she would say that. So that became important to me. But the other thing that really fell into place that kind of supercharged this book for me and made me want to write it is the idea of formation. And I was influenced by that a lot by becoming Anglican. So I discovered Anglicanism in the midst of all of this. And B, the works of Jamie Smith. And he wrote a book called Desiring the Kingdom. The language I needed, what I needed for the penny drop was the notion of formation, and how formation is actually not just what we believe, but the practices of our daily life, the practices of life and the practices of liturgy. And so he really applies that to our gathered liturgy on Sunday and talks also about spiritual practices in daily life. And so I sort of took that and said, like, what if I took those notions of liturgy, of formation, of formative practices is the language he uses, and looked at it in one day, in one very ordinary day. And that allowed me to get into the notion of liturgy, the notion of formation, but also, I mean, chapter 6 in that book, in Liturgy, the Ordinary, which is called Passing the Peace, is me completely wrestling with this question of what does it mean to pursue peace? What does it mean to seek justice, to care for the economically disadvantaged or disenfranchised? What does that look like for those of us who do have mortgages and kids and who are not Dorothy Day, how do we do that? Because what I don't want is it to be like, well, Dorothy Day gets to know Jesus and gets to live out her life serving the poor. And then the rest of us that raise kids and have mortgages and that sort of thing are, we just consume. We're just the consumers. And so figuring out how do we live in ways that are beautiful, that are just, that are seeking of God was really the project of the entire book. But especially, I think in that chapter, I drilled down into that. And so, so I think the idea of how do you meet God in everyday life? What does it mean that actually what we're called to is pretty small things, routines, habits, then the idea of liturgy and formative practices, that sort of like, that was the threads that I needed to kind of start to wrestle with these questions.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, Tish and I discuss finding a third way through some false dichotomies. Hey, friend, if you didn't know, I started a newsletter a while back that comes out every 2 weeks. I have been delighted to hear from so many of you about positive response to the newsletter. We call it the No Small Endeavor Notebook, where I riff on themes and topics related to our podcast, giving you additional material for thinking and doing in your own quest to make sense of what it might mean to live a good life. Join us by going now to nosmallendeavor.com and sign up there. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com to sign up now for our free No Small Endeavor Notebook newsletter. So let me move to kind of, in the 10 minutes we have left, to kind of a third move here that also harkens back to the first, but I think weaves its way through the second. So here you are, I think, raised Southern Baptist, have made yourself on the way to being ordained as an Anglican, holding on to Christian orthodoxy in public and writing for what many would call the liberal New York Times. So how do you think your, kind of what you were describing earlier as trying to find a way to hold on to rigorous notions of conviction in public? It seems that what you're doing is you're trying to say, the stereotypical right is not what I'm interested in. Stereotypical left is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in a third sort of way. Or so it seems to me you're saying, or at least getting at. Is that fair? Is that a fair enough way to kind of perhaps summarize what your current project in public is?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know if I've thought about it enough to think about if I want a third way. Anglicans love talking about the third way. So that makes sense to me. I mean, I will just say I don't, because what I'm accused of, and I think is there's been a bad notion of kind of both sidesism in that.
Right.
It's not that I think sort of both sides are equally wrong on things, on everything. But I also don't, so Dorothy Day is a hero. She keeps coming up a lot in this. She's a hero of mine. Nobody would describe her as moderate. Right. She wasn't moderate. She was radical, but she did not fit the binary. And there are ways that she's just a radical Catholic. So she was like radically pro-life, like radically. And she like doctrinally about sex, about marriage, in many ways was very conservative. But she also like did not believe in capitalism, for instance. I mean, she just was a radical progressive in many, many ways. So yes to what you're saying, third way, sure. But I would just say I don't seek the middle on issues. In some ways, I want to be sort of radically committed to truth and beauty and goodness. I'm not saying I am radically committed, but I hope to be radically committed to this, to the story of Jesus, the scriptures, and Christian orthodoxy. But I think that will make you radical just in ways that don't fit. So that might produce a third way.
Right. I mean, that fits with the title of one of your recent columns entitled, "The God I Know Is Not a Culture Warrior." So unpack that for us.
Yeah. So that piece I wrote a while ago, and I think I was reflecting on, there was a really beautiful church service that I went to on a Sunday, and someone was spontaneously, like, unplanned. We had baptisms that day, and someone unplanned, like, wanted to be baptized. So we had this like beautiful moment where this person came and received baptism, and it was just such a lovely, amazing time of worship. And then I opened up, you go on social media, and God just seems like mostly about sociological trends that we can fight over. God seems to be more or less a tool to bash each other with. The progressive left claims God to bash the right. The right certainly claims God to bash the left. And it just felt so different than the actual experience of worship. And so I was wrestling in that piece with saying, We are talking about the maker of heaven and earth here. But the way that our religious discourse is around God, one would think that, God just was like another pundit, and we were all kind of discussing the punditry of God, like we say, I love Tucker Carlson. Well, I hate Tucker Carlson. It's like just putting or whatever, Rachel Maddow, and then you have Jesus.
If you've not written a column entitled "The Punditry of God," then I think that you need to get that one out next week. Yeah. And
then when God comes up in our discourse, it tends to be sociological. So how are white evangelicals voting, or what is the progressive, left Christians think of this, or what does the progressive Catholics think? We talk about God as an American culture when we want to fight. And that is when God comes up in public usually. But if there is a God, which I think there is, God is so transcendent of all of that. And I don't mean God doesn't care about justice or God doesn't care about politics, but I think there was a time, I think, where we could be too pietistic and we got to keep God out of politics and blah, blah, blah. The pendulum swung so far the other way that now it seems that we only talk about God when we're talking about something we're fighting about, a notion of justice or gun control or whatever. I mean, I just wrote last week about God and gun control, so I'm fine with talking about that. But I want to say that at the end of the day, if the Christian story is true, which is worth arguing about whether or not it is, but if it is, when we rise to see the risen Christ, we're not going to be talking about the voting patterns of white evangelicals. We're just not. And so I was trying to say there's something so much more real about this, that this is the Christian faith and our conversations about faith. I mean, even since I've worked for the Times, I get letters all the time from agnostics, from Jewish rabbis. They're asking these questions. Like underneath all of this is these questions of like, what is it to be a human being? Right. How do we know God? How do we know what God wants? Can God say no to us? Can God disappoint us? Can God actually make a claim on us so much that it might change our moral behavior? Like, what happens when we die? How do we raise our kids? Where is light in the midst of suffering and darkness? Like, these are very real questions. And I feel like we never get to those questions as a culture in a church because we spend so much time fighting about a particular group of issues that matter, but don't only matter. And so that the God I know isn't a culture warrior was just calling people back to the idea, if we're going to talk about God, can we remember that there's more happening than just the culture wars when we're talking about God?
I don't remember, and this is a good place for us to end in the next couple of minutes, but I don't remember if it was in that same article or another one of your recent pieces, but you allude to the way in which the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah has been important to you in the injunction where he says to the Jews in exile, so they're kind of surrounded by people who don't believe what they believe, but he counsels them, seek the welfare of the city.
Yeah.
And you've discussed about how important that is for you. So any kind of closing commentary on how you see that agenda maybe getting at what you just described?
Well, it's worth noting, I mean, the things we fight about when we fight about the culture war stuff is what is the welfare of the city? What's best for the city? And we do have really different notions of that. So I don't deny that. I don't think that we can just sort of issue like, abortion or sexuality or the environment. I mean, we can't just all come together and say kumbaya, right? Like there are real conversations to be had. That said, I think the spirit that we enter those in is super, super important because, like I said, those are important conversations. Those aren't the sum total of what it means to seek the welfare of the city. So there are really important things that the Christian life claims or is wrestling with that are really important to the welfare of the city and that are never going to be a culture war issue. And so because of that, might not ever make the news. I mean, one of them is like, Is there actually a God that came to earth, died, and rose from the dead? Like, that's an important question for the welfare of the city. Like, we should wrestle with that. But there's other things, I think, like America is profoundly lonely. Most Americans live their life in an almost debilitating sense of loneliness. I think that faith has a lot to say to that, and faith communities have a lot to say to that. And we need to address that, but that's not a culture war issue. And so a lot of times we don't. I think America is a deeply fearful place. We live in a culture of fear and anxiety, and Christians participate in that and lead that as much as anyone else. But the Christian faith has a lot to say about fear and anxiety. So what does it mean to be a courageous people? These sorts of things are not culture war questions primarily. They're about becoming a certain type of people, like in a Stanley Hauerwas kind of way, like the church being the church. And I think we need to recall that and come back to that. And even when we approach divisive issues, which I've done multiple times, lots of people yell at me on Twitter. I think that we need to do it in a spirit of not trying to conquer, of being humble enough that we could be wrong, but also standing really courageously for what we believe, and engaging with other people in a profound way. I mean, this goes back to the pluralism thing. We're going to have different notions of good. We really are. But those need to be really robustly represented.
Right.
And I mean, the New York Times is not telling me to say this or getting any benefit from this. But I mean, honestly, the Times has done a great job in the time that I've been there. That 2 years, I've been at the Times about 2 years now. And they invited me in, precisely because I'm a slightly different viewpoint than a lot of Times columnists and also a lot of Times readers. And they've done that really intentionally. They have a pretty broad, they brought on David French, who's like to the right of me politically. And they brought on Tressie McMillan Cotton this year, who's, quite a bit to the left of David French for sure, but also of a lot of the others. So they're really seeking a representation of a lot of different viewpoints. And that gives me hope. I think it gives me hope that I think we're all, not all people, but I think most people are really what keeps them up at night. At the end of the day, we're seeking truth and beauty and goodness. And we have really different ideas of what that is. But I really believe that like truth rises to the top, that if we are able to kind of talk about things, if we're able to hash things out, more good will come from that. Like more flourishing in our communities, more welfare of the city will come from that than if we're not able to talk and wrestle and really approach just deep differences and hash it out, and figure out ways like with loneliness or the really intense mental health crisis that we're seeing in teenagers, to work with people across ideological lines to address some of that we don't have to agree on everything to try to get some good done in the city,
Been talking to Tish Warren, columnist for Christianity Today, and also a columnist for the New York Times. Tish, thanks so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with author, Anglican priest, and New York Times columnist Tish Warren. If you missed a portion of this interview or would like to have access to the complete unabridged version, you can follow our podcast, No Small Endeavor, wherever you listen. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our right, thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.